All right. So my name is Pietro Finn, and I'm presenting my video presentation for my research proposal for IPH 311 research methods. It's entitled Cardiac-Related Complications in COVID-19 Patients Hospitalized in the University of Michigan Hospital System in the year 2020. So my introduction. So the SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 is the virus responsible for the current pandemic we're experiencing right now. It is a deadly respiratory illness that's very contagious. It has caused a worldwide pandemic for the past couple months. And right now, the United States is the epicenter of the largest growing of cases. So during COVID-19 infection can lead to inflammation, which can lead to complications and death of the patient. The inflammation in the thoracic cavity, contains the heart and lungs, leads to cardiac injury and possible complications in these patients. And so we must fully understand how this virus affects the body and how it affects the heart and lungs in order to understand this virus and overcome it as a society. So the virus originated in Wuhan, China, as according to the CDC. Currently in the world, according to the World Health Organization, there are 54 plus million cases with 1.3 million deaths. In the United States, there have been over 10.7 million cases so far, including 155,000 that were recorded in the last 24 hours, with over 243,000 deaths. That's quite a bit, and we are experiencing the brunt of the pandemic at the moment. So as I move my screen down, you can see this graph of COVID infections in the United States. You can see here it is as the pandemic began here in this country in March. There's that big uptick in cases that sent us all home from college. And then we gradually weaned down to get to the summer. We're doing good with quarantining and wearing masks and doing stuff. And then summer hit and we got that big uptick in cases. And some people call this the second wave, but technically this is all the first wave since we've never gone down to no new cases a day. And so after this big bump in the summer, we went down a little bit as people got to school and started really following those regulations. And as soon as we get over here into school, people start breaking those regulations, and you can see the massive uptick in cases that's happening here and almost exponential growth, which is very alarming for epidemiologists and just anyone who understands how severe this virus is. And so another component of the virus is that it has a very long latent period, in which that means once it gets into the body and infects the body, it can be up to 14 or 15 days until someone starts experiencing symptoms or a real infection can manifest that's detectable by tests. And even during this period, people are contagious, and even people who are asymptomatic, people who don't show any symptoms, even though they do have an active COVID-19 infection, they can still transmit the virus to other people, and it's still very infectious. So masks and social distancing, washing your hands are all very important right now. And so one of the studies I found examined a bunch of patients and found that COVID-19 was associated with cardiac inflammation even after recovery. This study looked at a bunch of patients and saw that even 6 months after recovery, they were still experiencing a ton of manifestations in the heart. And then another study I found that cardiac damage is multifactorial. So the etiology of this is that there's not just one thing that causes it. There's many different stresses. One of them includes enhanced inflammatory status in the tissue surrounding the heart, which can cause these kind of complications, and that kind of inflammation is very prevalent in COVID-19 infection. So for some more previous research, a history of cardiac injuries and events increases the risk of additional injuries to the heart in COVID-19 infection. The most likely complication for a COVID-19 patient is an arrhythmic event or acute cardiac injury, other than acute respiratory illness, of course. The most likely complication for a COVID-19 patient, sorry, I read that one already. Stroke can also be a complication of COVID-19, but usually only occurs in patients with a history of stroke. So that's not one of the more prevalent ones. So it doesn't really warrant a lot more investigation. Pre-existing conditions, particularly cardiovascular, greatly increase someone's risk of death during COVID-19 infection. Men have a higher ACE2 concentration in their blood plasma, which was positively correlated with a higher mortality rate for COVID-19 infection. Uh, and lastly, patients undergoing treatment with hydroxychloroquine alone and in combination with azithromycin were associated with decreased mortality rates from COVID-19 infection. This was a study done at the Henry Ford Hospital System in Southern Michigan, and the methods of that study, the design of that study is really what inspired me to create a design of this one. So for research gaps, COVID-19 is still a really new topic. Most of the literature out there are literature reviews of other papers, case studies, case review series, and the ones that get the most attention are the randomized controlled trials for potential vaccines. You've seen some of those in the news from Pfizer and others. So also very little research has been done on cardiac related complications or specific hospital systems in Michigan. So that's what I'd like to fill in those gaps with this kind of research. So the purpose of this study is to determine the rate of cardiac related complications in COVID-19 patients hospitalized in the University of Michigan hospital system in 2020. This paper also aims to investigate the associations between demographic variables and cardiac related complications and at what rate these patients who develop these complications die in hospital. So the first aim of this study is to determine the rate of cardiac related complications in COVID-19 patients hospitalized in the U of M hospital system in 2020 and what confounding variables are associated with these complications. So hypothesis 1A, it's stated that 25% of COVID-19 patients hospitalized in the U of M hospital system in 2020 will have experienced a cardiac related complication. And that's finding the incidence and the rate. The hypothesis 1B is that patients hospitalized for COVID-19 in the U of M hospital system in 2020 with pre-existing conditions will be positively correlated with higher rates of cardiac related complications. And age will also be positively correlated with these complications. So the second aim was to determine the mortality rate of COVID-19 patients hospitalized in the U of M system who in 2020 who developed these kind of complications. And so my hypothesis for this aim is that 75% of the patients hospitalized in the U of M system in 2020 who developed these kind of complications will die in the hospital. The limitations of this study, this study doesn't record instances of patients developing complications after being discharged from the hospital and being at home. So those people won't be included and their data won't be counted. So we may not get a full picture of the rate of complications from this virus. All data is collected from one hospital system in one state. So that means that the data collected in this experiment will not be entirely representative of the entire United States or the entirety of Michigan for that matter. Children are more likely to be taken to a hospital system that may be excluded from the study. So they might be taken to another children's hospital or just somewhere that we wouldn't get their data. And lastly, the pandemic is still going on, and this snapshot is unlikely to contain the whole trend of the COVID-19 pandemic. So some delimitations, we have no need to examine lengthy patient experience reports because we are working with either categorical or numerical data. And then this same study can be applied to any hospital system or any individual hospital to investigate these kinds of incidences at different levels of population. And lastly, the study can be repeated to better understand the effects of COVID in later years. This study could be repeated in 2021, 22, however long COVID decides to stay with us. So on to methods. This study will utilize a retrospective observational cohort study design. This is when a researcher looks back over a period of time, examining data on patients with a particular outcome in order to determine risk or protection factors. So the outcome being observed in this study is whether or not a COVID-19 patient hospitalized in the U of M hospital system in 2020 developed cardiac related complications in hospital, if those patients died, and of course. So, and the risk and protective factors being investigated are the demographic variables of the patient data. So looking at their age, their sex, their race, how those things are related to the development of cardiac-related complications, and if there's any associations to be drawn there. So for variables, the independent variables include age, sex, pre-existing health conditions and comorbidities, race slash ethnicity, uh, cardiac related complications, which is the independent variable for the mortality dependent variable, and cause of death. And so for dependent variables, we have cardiac related complications for the first couple of independents. And this includes any complication being related to the heart or vasculature. It includes but isn't limited to infarction, hypertrophy, acute cardiac injury, stroke, and etc. So, and then mortality, did the patient die while they were in hospital? If they died outside of the hospital after they were released, there's no way for us to have that data and no way for us to include them in the study. And then some extraneous variables could be the quality of the care received that could potentially determine whether a patient lived or died in hospital, and also the quality of the life support systems. If those systems had been undergoing quite a bit of stress with a big influx in hospitalizations, then potentially more patients could die for lack of access or just lack of effectiveness. For the participants, all participants must be hospitalized for COVID-19 in the University of Michigan hospital system in the year 2020. The sample size for this study is currently unknown because the year is not over. We don't know how many people are going to be hospitalized by the end of the year, and we'll have those numbers at the beginning of 2021. There's no recruitment required. I don't have to actively recruit any patients because their data is already in the hospital network. No surveys are required. I don't have to deal with non-response bias or people just ignoring me. And then the idea of informed consent for this study, these patients really consented to having their information used by the hospital for whatever purpose, as long as it's kept confidential in their forms. However, there may be some discussion on the IRB of whether or not an informed consent form may be needed. For equipment, not much equipment is needed for this study, only a computer to access the database to, if need be, to collect the data and to perform statistical analysis. You'd also need some statistics software to compute everything, a telephone to contact the hospital system if you need to. If you can't find the information on a database and need to have an actual spreadsheet sent to you, then that's what you'd have to do. And then also previous training in statistics and epidemiology to understand the ideas behind incidence and prevalence and how to conduct statistical tests like t-tests and understand p-values. For the procedures for this investigation, data collection begins in 2021 after all the hospitalizations for 2020 have been either discharged or passed away. So to begin, the researcher will contact the hospital system in some way or the database and retrieve the necessary data. This anonymous patient data will include the COVID-19 diagnosis, age, sex, any pre-existing conditions, race and ethnicity, official documented cause of death, if applicable, if they did die, and any documented cardiac related complications. And then the patient data will be deemed complete and able to undergo analysis if all that info is present. And then from then you can move on to statistical analysis. And last, for data analysis, the incident rate of cardiac related complications can be calculated by dividing the total number of patients who develop them by the total number of patients who were hospitalized for COVID-19. Next, the mortality rate of these hospitalized patients can be calculated by dividing the number of COVID-19 patients who developed these cardiac-related complications and died by the number of COVID-19 patients who only developed these complications and died or not, just the total number. And then lastly, we can examine some of these demographic variables and how they're associated with rates of cardiac-related complications by tabulating all of these extraneous variables and finding any correlations using t-tests and other statistical tests. Lastly, here's my references. Yeah, thank you very much.